there's some history here, which is a little bit amusing. In 2014, I predicted that what transhumanism needed was a young person to fix it, that they had all these 50 plus white people trying to generate enthusiasm and so on, and more discord. And then 6 years later, you may think this is something that I sort of set up, but no, Taryn was using an AHS computer that didn't have video. So I wasn't sure she was a real student. I knew there was a student by that name, but I'd never seen an image. And on the day that David Pierce taught, we started talking about fixing transhumanism. And Taryn said she thought she could maybe do it. Everything sort of fell into place. So anyway, briefly, that's the story. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave you to Taryn Stokowski.
Thank you. Okay, I will share my screen and minimize that. Okay, so first of all, hi everyone. So as Kim said, I'm Taryn. Today my presentation is titled Flourishing in Culture and Health Research. You're welcome to interrupt me at any time, either like talking or in the chat. I love chatting, and I'm totally flexible today. So just keep me in the loop. Let me get this going. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that me and the University of Alberta are both situated on Treaty 6 territory. We're really fortunate to be able to learn and grow on this territory and to, learn from the Indigenous people that surround us. Today, I'll be talking about how we, meaning individuals involved in health promotion and technology, might ensure that humans across the globe have the opportunity to flourish. So I want to start with a disclaimer that I don't have all the answers. I think that I'm better at posing questions and digging deeper than coming up with concrete solutions. I think that these issues are very complex, and I'm hoping that our discussion today can just kind of stimulate some thoughts for you. My background is in women's studies. I also did biology, but my women's studies background is coming out a lot here, where I studied critical theory, feminist philosophy of science. I've done some adaptive leadership stuff, and I've also been part of international humanitarian projects. So that's kind of the context I'm coming from here. I really hope that you watched the video that I had Dr. Sola send you. This is the screen grab of it. It was an audio of a speaker called Alan Watts, and the YouTube channel put nice graphics over top of it. If you haven't watched it, I'll try to explain, but hopefully you've watched it. And so I'd like to start first, just to get a little icebreaker going. I'd like you guys to tell me what science is to you. It can be simple, complex, however you'd like to answer. I'd like you to tell me what science is. Please.
Yeah, I'd say science is process of trying to understand things that aren't particularly obvious, either on a big scale or a small scale, everywhere in between.
Okay, I like that. What would you say that process entails?
A lot of trial and error.
Okay.
I think is really, when it comes down to it, what a lot of science is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I when you pose that question, I had to think a sec, because you're always like, oh yeah, like you use this scientific method, but you never actually like think of like what does it act like, it's like you always like think of it like, I don't know, like I would always just say, oh yeah, like the scientific way to do this, but you're like what does scientific even mean? But yeah, I'll give it a shot. I think to me, from someone with like a math and computer science background, probably like a very like quantitative approach to solving problems, where you have kind of objective metrics and yeah, quantitative and objective ways to going about solving those issues. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Okay,
Does it-
I'm gonna take a stab here and
Okay.
say that science is the process of like thinking and acknowledging theories that already exist, and then finding a way to either disprove them or like making them better. And as both have already kind of alluded to, trial and error is a big part of that. So like experimentation and confirmation of previous theories, but also like in the process, let's say you try to recreate something that already exists, you might find like a better way to do it. And so by nature, you've done science and you've changed science. So yeah, that's how I kind of see it.
Okay. I like that kind of iterative, and yeah, I like that. Thank you. You've mostly covered my points. Does anyone have anything else to add before I move on? No? Okay. So I think you guys nailed it. Here are some descriptors that I would use. So quantitative is a big one that I want to focus on today. We could say it's precise, falsifiable, physical, objective, value-free, rational. And I'd really like us to think of science as a way of knowing. So that's what epistemology means, kind of how we know what we know, how we gather information, but also as an ideology. We gather knowledge and then we use it a certain way, right? It's not a neutral thing that we just, hold in a little box. It has a lot of implications for how we think and how we act in the world. This, of course, is in contrast to experiential knowledge or qualitative knowledge. In women's studies, we call this standpoint epistemology. So that means, knowledge that you can only get from being in a certain like social position. And this type of knowledge is seen as more opinion, ambiguous, subjective, emotional. Yeah, so those are two kind of the contrasts. I'm sure you're familiar with this already. And so if you watch Watts's video, I'm gonna kind of tease out, it was a very complicated video. I'm sorry for that, but 2 points that I'd like to pick out from there is that perhaps science is at times an oversimplification. As Watts points out, the world is an enormously complex, interrelated organism, and it's really hard to do science in a vacuum. And as we'll touch on in a bit, the kind of ideology bit of science is a little bit conceitful. We sometimes use science as a way to justify doing things and, like justify doing certain things, thinking that we know what's good for ourselves or for other people, but that may not always be the case. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about kind of human flourishing. So here, human flourishing means living within an optimum range of human functioning, or it's a state of being, and it's kind of contrasted to pathology. That feels very vague because it is. The Harvard Institute of Human Flourishing, they've kind of broken it down into 6 domains, which we can kind of work with, although of course there's room for improvement there too. But perhaps, happiness, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships, and then financial and material stability. And so if we take these domains seriously and we think about how we would actually study and work to improve these things, how many do you think can really be quantified? If we're saying that science is kind of this quantifiable, objective thing. I say maybe two. I think the others have a little bit more qualitative elements, but we'll get back to that. So if we take these seriously and we think, okay, cool. Some aspects of mental and physical health can be studied. Some aspect of financial and material stability can be studied using the scientific method. Great. Is it actually effective? As Watts kind of points out, our interventions are usually just the current best practice. Often these answers are formulaic, and they often have unintended or unforeseeable consequences. And science often kind of brings things down and then tries to apply that law universally. But as I'm sure you can understand, that's not always the most effective way of doing something. Some things just aren't universal. So the example that he gave in the video was the use of DDT, which was this insecticide that, was this big boom. It was great when it first came out, but then it was eventually found out to be quite toxic and bad for the environment. And he also gives the example of this grain, which became, like a genetically modified grain, which then kind of had some ecological consequences. So one of the points that he makes, and that is really big in, Eastern philosophy, is that there's always some way that we need to pay for something. Even if something has benefits, it's always going to come to some kind of cost. And I think, we really want to put a lot of stock in the good, but we need to be really mindful of the bad as well. And so the other kind of contest that Watts has of science and progress, perhaps, is what I'm terming conceit. He doesn't necessarily use that word, but I think that it's the best word to kind of describe what he's thinking. So conceit is characterized by, kind of being a bit proud, and, being right feels really good. He talks about how, historically people have, like white people have kind of gone out and conquered the world, and it feels really great to be, doing all these great things, bringing democracy, but bringing democracy with guns, which isn't actually that peaceful. And of course, there's an element of ignorance that comes with this. When we think that we have the right answer, we kind of protect it, and we might not look into other options or consider other things if we genuinely think that we have the best idea. This, of course, also lends to kind of a competitiveness. When we think in terms of either or like winning and losing, we want our idea to be the best. We don't want to concede that maybe a different idea could be better. I think that we hold on to science and our scientific practice really closely. And so this might make us into troublemakers as scientists, because we can be critical of, or defensive of critical analysis, and kind of ignore the possibilities of, well, what if circumstances change? What if what we do ends up causing harm? What could we be ignoring? What are those negative side effects that could be coming with the good that we're trying to do? So this leads me to a term called epistemological hegemony. So hegemony is kind of like a political term, which refers to domination. So in this context, epistemological, knowledge-based hegemony power represents a concern for the domination of one view of knowledge and the subordination of all other forms. Here, we're delegitimating the knowledge of cultural, quote, others as one of the foundation stones of cultural domination. So I hope you can see how like the connection I'm making here to science being this kind of objective thing, this way of knowing that we're kind of taking out into the world, and maybe not acknowledging other forms of knowledge making in the process. So this says it clearly, or more clearly, where we've kind of put the scientific way of knowing above perhaps standpoint. And I'm sure there's other, this is a fairly simplistic explanation of this hegemony, but there's much more nuance to be had here. But, culturally, we've really latched on to science being this rational, falsifiable, objective thing. And that's not to say that it doesn't have value. That's not the case at all, but that we've kind of put it on a pedestal, and in the process, we might be missing other things. And so if we look historically, science has really ties in, masculinity, authority, rationality. It's kind of tied up in colonialism and imperialism. This idea of like dominating other people, being right and being brought over to help people. And it really values progress at all costs. And so some people argue that this is actually an act of violence, which sounds heavy. I'm not trying to attack anybody. I'm kind of stirring the pot on purpose. So if we look at the definition of violence, it, according to the World Health Organization, includes the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. That's heavy. That's very heavy. But this is all to say that perhaps violence could include power dynamics that disregard an individual's humanity, which includes an act of power over another. And so this ties back to what Watts said. He said that we white Anglo-Saxons, is his term, have been on a rampage to improve the world. And he gives us a little silly example of the monkey helping the fish by putting it up the tree. I would like to kind of preface that just because something might be violent doesn't mean that it's actually malicious. I think, the monkey, the people bringing technology to other people, other places, I think they do it with a lot of good in their heart and a lot of good intention. But that doesn't necessarily excuse the possible repercussions and outcomes for certain people. I really like this quote. I think that it sums up exactly what I mean. So that, to love someone without knowing how to love them wounds that person. But to know how to love someone, we have to understand them. And to understand, we need to listen. So when we, force anything, no matter how good it might seem, onto other people or onto, like a group of people or a single person, if that's not what they actually, like what aligns with them and what they need, we could be doing something violent. So we may rush to help people without fully understanding how that problem is actually experienced firsthand. And Watts would call this perhaps conceited, because we believe our method is universal and our understanding is sufficient enough to actually do something when that might not be the case. Okay, now that I've stirred the pot, I want you guys to tell me what you think of this idea. And you can disagree with me, but I want you to tell me if you think that science can be violent. I showed this video to one of my friends, and like explained my lecture to them, and they got so mad. Like they got really mad at me. And yeah, I understand. But I think, I don't know, I hope you can see where I'm coming from. Tell me what you guys think. Can science be violent?
So, maybe I could say something here just about the video game from Alan Watts. So many of you may know that an award-winning video game called the Everything Game came from these Alan Watts audio quotes and that sort of thing. And it's really the only video game that I know much about, but it's extremely peaceful, let me say. Despite all the things that Alan Watts says that might really get you upset, that video game is really quite calming, I find, even the funny way that the animals move and everything. Yeah. And anyway, sorry, I wasn't supposed to talk about it. I'd give you some moments for really deep comments now. Yeah. So let's hear them.
Yeah. Tell me.
Yeah, I don't know if science itself is violent as an entity, but it can certainly lead and sometimes justify violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when people or groups or institutions commit what we would consider to be acts of violence, a lot of times for them it's justified or it's valid because scientifically it's a good idea or a good act or a good solution.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's a tricky question.
It is. It's meant to be a tricky question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think, yeah, kind of going off of that too, like, I guess, like, yeah, it's clear that, institutions and organizations have weaponized science, like atomic bombs and eugenics and things like that. But it kind of brings the question of like, okay, can science as an entity itself be violent? Well, it's like, is natural like disasters, like, to understand these kind of things, do bad natural things have to happen to people? Like, do some people have to suffer so that we can gain a better understanding of the universe? So not really an answer to this question, just kind of a thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but and building off that idea, I think you have to look at whether the science itself is causing the violence or whether there's a human presence behind it. And Scott brought up natural disasters and the atomic bomb, and I think, one of those, in order for it to cause violence, there needs to be clear human direction behind it, whereas another one, there doesn't have to be, but it certainly is an influencing factor.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I appreciate those perspectives. Definitely, science, like it can be. Again, I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate here, picking kind of an extreme thing for us to talk about. But I agree. I'm a scientist myself. I don't think that is this clear black and white issue. I think that, you know, making these tools and then using them, those are two different things sometimes. But I think, to further play the devil's advocate, part of, you know, like, why are we choosing to make certain tools, or why are we choosing to research certain things, or, you know, what are we not considering or not doing because of this goal for progress? And are there things that we're kind of blinded to because we're thinking in this science brain? Does that make sense? Yes. Graham?
Yeah.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense. And I just wanted to like touch on another thing. I don't know if this was mentioned, but I also think that if you look at the scientific approach in general and how we kind of learn things, for example, about the human body, that itself is usually a somewhat of a violent process. Like, for example, in a Bio 207 lab, we ended up killing about, like, I think within my class alone, over 50 fruit flies to do a 20-minute experiment. So that is a violent act against the fruit flies. And it was all to get, I guess, a further understanding of science. So I guess also just looking at the approach that we take, a lot of the time, it's usually a little bit unethical. So I guess that's another consideration.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, we interrupted someone else who was going to speak.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I was just gonna make a point about how you're talking about like the reasons, you know, scientists go about specific areas of research and interest. And yeah, it's like pretty interesting to see, because I think throughout history there's like a lot of cases where, you know, there's this great scientific finding that some scientists had worked on but didn't really foresee consequences. And, you know, if you put those ideas into people with bad ideas or applications of those ideas, like, then you know, you begin to see violent acts that that, you know, weaponize science. So, and even, you know, from a like less extreme standpoint, right? Like, I think even if you look at like social media and like technology today, like, I don't think when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, he would have intended, you know, all these consequences. And he's spoken about this before. So yeah, I think that's kind of like a relevant top like area of discussion related to this.
Thank you. Yes, I think about that too. How we've kind of released these things out into the world, and yeah, he could have never imagined the things that Facebook has been involved in, both good and bad. I'm sure there's some incredible things that technology has enabled us to do, but also equally terrible things that have happened. Okay, let me rephrase this one little way, and then we'll move on. Do you think ideas can be violent? Because we're talking a lot about, like, a lot of the examples that you guys have given have been like physical things. But what I'm part of what I'm getting at here is also the idea of knowledge being weaponized and stories being erased, or, you know, being dominated over with other ideas. Do you think that violence is only, like, should it just be physical, or what do you think about kind of ideas being violent or knowledge being violent?
In terms of ideas, certainly they can definitely be violent. I think on a large scale and on a small scale. Take something like, for example, the Holocaust. at its essence, that was based on one person's ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And even in our day-to-day lives, I'm sure we've all been in situations where we're in a, conflict or something, and we're like, yeah, I could just sock that guy in the jaw.
Yeah.
Those are violent ideas. Whether we act on them or not is a
Mm-hmm.
different topic, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly ideas can be violent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's also like might be important to ask like what it means to be violent, because let's say someone shoved me at like the LRT station and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna go sock him in the face, but and I like never act upon it, and no one ever knows that I had this idea or thought,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, is that violent then? Like,
Mm-hmm.
if it never hurts anyone and no one ever knows, right? So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the more like, I don't know, kind of spicy things that Watts says in his video, which I was planning on getting to at the end of this, but I feel like it would be good to bring up now. Are you guys familiar with like the Inquisition, where they kind of went out and tried to make everyone follow Catholicism or Christianity, and there was like physical violence associated with that, but that they, at the time, really thought that they were doing the right thing. They thought that not following religion was like a terrible evil, and that these people were sick. And Watts compares that to psychiatry, like modern psychiatry, and how we are kind of repeating the same pattern of finding this evil, but using now science instead of religion to justify hooking people up to wires or injecting them with questionable substances or locking them in a room. What do you guys make of that parallel?
I think there's some merit to that parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not much to be said about the ethics behind it, but
Mm-hmm.
the parallel itself like makes sense. Like you can even expand it beyond psychiatry, like just
Yeah.
some medical practices, or it might not even have to do with medical practices, like some homeopathic or acupuncture or naturopathic practices, like do
Mm-hmm.
very experimental things that might seem questionable on the surface, but they're in the interest of health or well-being or betterment. So, I mean, when it comes from a place of like helping you, it seems justifiable. But like when you really break it down to like what's actually being done to you,
Mm-hmm.
an argument can be made that it's quasi-violent. So,
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I think just one important distinction that needs to be made is the individual or the group who have these acts of violence committed upon them,
Mm-hmm.
sort of what their, I guess, how are they accepting it? When you look at, for example, psychiatry or homeopathic medicine or whatever, there are situations where a person will go themselves and seek it out.
Mm-hmm.
And you compare that to the Inquisition, where I don't think anybody was seeking that out from the side of, the people who were, I don't know what the word is, inquisitioned, whatever it is. But
Yeah.
yeah, that also, because that plays a big role in how we view it, whether we consider it violent or whether we consider it something that is acceptable and normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for that distinction. I share that criticism of the metaphor there, or the comparison there. You're right. I think that there's I mean, it's a whole conversation about like, have we built up psychiatry? I don't know why I'm picking on psychiatry. It's just an easy target, I guess. But like, have we built up psychiatry so that people feel like they don't have another choice? Or, you know what I mean? Like, there's kind of that other layer of, is it really what their decision, like how much are they influenced by this rhetoric that psychiatry is the best, in the same way that, you know, people might be influenced by the idea that religion is the best, or, you know, like that kind of undercurrent. But I totally agree. People going out and slaughtering people and, yeah, rounding them up, there's a different tone there in consent and autonomy, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll play devil's advocate here also, with like the whole consent thing. Like, oh, if you seek it out and you're accepting of whatever it may be, then
Mhm.
it might not be considered violent or evil. But
Mhm.
you know, what if like, you know, you're dying and you just do not want this treatment because it goes against whatever it may be, like for whatever reason, and someone forces that treatment upon you and it saves your life, like, is that, so would that be evil, right? Like, maybe to the person that refused the treatment, yeah, yes.
Mhm.
But you know, I think a lot of people would also disagree that, you know, saving a life is more important than whatever. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know, just an interesting
Yeah,
thought.
thank you. For sure. I think, yeah, it's a very, very complicated, nuanced topic, for sure. The whole like consent and power and, you know, people's like the differing perspectives of what the good is, right? Is the good saving lives? Is the good dying when your time is up? Like, because some people have that perspective that when it's time to go, it's time to go, and extending your life is unnatural, or, you know, people have that perspective. And it's really complicated to balance all of those things. Thank you. Okay, we will move on and we can talk more after. So here are the challenges that I've kind of pointed out, that perhaps I'm using the word oversimplified. I don't really, it's meant to encapsulate a lot of different things, but just and then this, perhaps, you know, we think that we have the right answer and we can do things. And perhaps this is violent, perhaps it's not. But this kind of domination of this knowledge system. And so I think philosophically, the best remedy for this kind of domination of knowledge is intellectual humility. This needs to include pessimistic induction, or I think it needs to include pessimistic induction. So by definition, this means that if past successful and accepted scientific theories have been found to be false, we have no reason to believe that scientific realists claim that our currently successful theories are actually true. We don't have to necessarily take it that far. Perhaps some scientific theories are true, and we can work with them. But I think that practicing effective intellectual humility as scientists, as people invested in improving the welfare of others, we should maintain like a critical opinion of our scientific theories, and we really ought to welcome them to be disproven and expanded upon. I was happy to hear, I forget who it was, but someone said that science is kind of that iterative thing. And I think that's totally part of this. You know, I think resisting dogmatic things that just kind of become entrenched and keeping the possibility for things to be improved is ways that we can help ensure that science is actually doing what it needs to do. And of course, practicing self-reflexivity. So by definition, this is taking account of oneself. So that means the researcher is kind of taking account of themselves with regards to the knowledge that they're producing. So this means being critical of ourselves, recognizing our epistemological assumptions, our motivations, our biases, whether we have attachment to certain solutions, etc., so that we can not just get stuck in that, old way of thinking, but allowing new things to come and allowing ourselves to be challenged and grow. And really, it takes a lot of self-awareness to admit that you're wrong. It's easier said than done. But when we embrace that, we become much better scientists, much better, whatever you want to be, but like technological people, medical personnel, being involved in that. So here's kind of my little schematic of, this overriding, domineering scientific ideology. We can kind of combat that with pessimistic induction, self-reflexivity, and then this will lead us to potentially embracing things that are not just science, like hard science, but perhaps integrating other forms of knowledge into quantitative knowledge. So this includes among other things, includes collaborative intelligence and potentially culture and health research. So as I've said, this is kind of a false dichotomy. We don't need to put quantitative and qualitative knowledge at odds with each other. They can actually be used to complement each other. We don't need to just say, oh, this is the most objective, whatever, that's going to be the most effective. We don't need to say that. Like we can have subjective elements that actually improve our objective, like quantitative research. So the term collaborative intelligence, it really just refers to humans and artificial intelligence joining forces. I really like this picture from this journal article, or I don't know what journal article it is, but this article. And so this is a quote from someone who's really deep on like criticizing artificial intelligence. So he says, the potential of big payoffs for the advocated future artificial intelligence applications should not be created via blunt automation alone, but involve cooperation between humans and machine intelligence. It should not be a substitution for human intelligence and labor, but complement and improve humans' mental and physical skills. So if we go back to thinking about, human flourishing and how we can study that and improve that, when we think about combining quantitative and qualitative measures together, we can imagine that would actually improve what we're able to do, given that these things are not so cut and dry, and given that everything is so interrelated. Combining these two things will actually seems like it'll give us a lot more opportunities and ways to do things. But of course, when we think of qualitative data, we often think of like surveys and, like I think of psychological research, but I'm sure it goes far beyond that. But we think of like sitting down and interviewing people. But we need to be mindful that a lot of our studies that have generated qualitative data are often biased towards Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic societies. And that these may not, like this information may not actually represent the whole human population. So we need to continue to expand what we mean by integrating human and artificial intelligence, qualitative and quantitative data, etc. So another kind of way that this, I don't want to say war between qualitative and quantitative, but kind of bringing in the qualitative into the quantitative, way of doing things could be culture in health research. So this book that we're going to talk about, they say that more sophisticated research designs based on the inclusion of culture, however culture is framed, in a range of public health research and intervention approaches is needed in order to better explain and better address contextual influences over population health behaviors. So this is coming from this book, When Culture Impacts Health. So they really talk about like public health initiatives, and they talk about how doing things by the books and kind of doing things how they might seem logically is insufficient. I'll explain. So first, this kind of is all part of the greater project of decolonizing the academy. So a decolonized academy is interdisciplinary and politically proactive. It respects indigenous epistemologies and encourages interpretive first-person methodologies. It honors different versions of science and empirical activity, as well as values cultural criticism in the name of social justice. It seeks models of human subject research that are not constrained by biomedical positive assumptions. So when people conduct culture in health research, they often do ethnography. I'm not sure. We'll say that's how it's pronounced, which would include like long-term fieldwork where they would observe, participate in communities, discuss with people, and really get to know what that culture is like. And it could also involve, different types of surveys where people are actually just asked questions and, pulled aside and asked for their opinion. Culture in health research often involves multi-method teams. So I don't know, I can't think of like, this course deals a lot with artificial intelligence. So I'll try to think of an example of that. But, let's say you're trying to do something in Nepal and you want to bring artificial intelligence to do something there. Let's say you want to work on traffic in Nepal. That seems neutral enough. So you could probably do something with artificial intelligence, but to actually make that effective, they would also then work in the cultural context. Maybe Nepalese drivers, like to honk their horn, or maybe they don't like stop signs, or, maybe they don't respect pedestrian signs, and understanding those more social factors would help actually improve what artificial intelligence could do. So culture and health research involves these multi-method teams. So perhaps scientists, but also anthropologists, sociologists, etc. And in this book, many of the chapters leaned towards embracing really complex analyses and layering multiple different theories, disciplines, and methods. And it's important to note that change is complicated. As we kind of discussed, like assessing not only if people want to change and want whatever is being given to them or presented to them, but also implementing it is very complicated. So these researchers found that it's necessary to understand the perspectives of people in the context of their everyday lives if an intervention is to be successful. Sometimes the perspectives of the people may be described as lay or irrational or traditional. And if you kind of think about that dichotomy that I was explaining about, science being rational and kind of being placed above things that are irrational, you can see that maybe there's like a power relation there. But ultimately, people don't easily relinquish their beliefs and practices when they're sensible and functional to them, even if they're being told to do so for health or safety reasons. If someone is attached to something that, even though feels irrational to an outsider, coming in and saying, well, this is the more rational way of doing it, or this is the more scientific way of doing it, Doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. Doesn't mean they'll actually want to adopt it or be able to adopt it. And this isn't limited to, far away places. When we think about obesity and smoking in so-called advanced societies, we can see that, quote, like modern citizens are just as, tied to their unhealthy practices and beliefs as those so-called traditional societies. And of course, in societies dominated by this scientific discourse of cause and effect, health risks, illness, and disease remain very emotional topics, and they're subject to these non-scientific interpretations and perhaps unhelpful behaviors. So even if we are going out and saying we've got the science has unlocked the greatest thing ever, we're still limited by these non-scientific contextual factors. So an example, this is actually an example. I don't know anything about Nepalese traffic. That was my off-the-cuff example. But how can you improve access to clean water in a resource-poor environment? The obvious answer would be to add a well near the community, right? That seems pretty rational, pretty logical. You could draw up the best plans, use all the science, I don't know, figure out how to purify the water great, and it would be great, right? But these researchers found that it wasn't that simple, that the people who in those communities, I forget where it was exactly, but the individuals who were responsible for getting the water for the family were generally the women. And so they found that in order for people to actually be accessing the water and get it, they had to not only provide that infrastructure, but also understand how these women went about their daily lives, and to ensure that even though they wanted this water, that the act of getting the water wasn't too disruptive or onerous, because otherwise they just wouldn't do it. Even though it was perfectly logical for them to go get the water, in practice, in real life, it was a lot more complicated than that. Here's just some notes on culture. These are kind of, kind of bonus, but culture, as we're talking about it here, kind of this, I hope you're understanding that I'm kind of saying this is like culture kind of wraps up with this qualitative and standpoint epistemology in contrast to the scientific epistemology. So culture really remains like spatially, socially, environmentally, and historically located, despite how much globalization has happened. There's still a lot of diversity. Changes can be slow or they can be fast, depending on a multitude of factors. And the way that culture transmits is usually through very opaque mechanisms. People getting to know each other, socializing, just kind of getting, all these copying, socialization, normalization, distinction. I don't know what all those terms mean exactly, but just the act of being around each other, rather than like handing over something nice and neat. And different health relevant cultural processes or modes of shaping those health practices can be widespread. However, they often play out or are manifested differently according to these like more local contexts. So even if, I'm trying to think of like a Canadian example, but even if we're talking about smoking in Canada, perhaps there's trends across Canada, but in Edmonton, there's certain trends, or, even though kind of the cultural consciousness is similar across Canada, there's slightly different nuances depending on the location. And so those kind of things can be taken into consideration to really make effective change. And then, of course, building from those preceding points, a cultural perspective is essential to understanding the nature, persistence, and mutability of health risks. It's not just as simple as the logical thing all the time. This type of research and implementing these type of things is certainly not easy. It's very difficult to get funding for these things. It's very complicated stuff, and both doing the research and making the change involves a lot of trust and relationship building, whether it's abroad or here in Canada even. And of course, when we think about this type of research, it's not just, okay, how can we take this idea that we have, give it to someone else and make them happy with it? I think that the best way to really approach this and to kind of break down that power dynamic in that the epistemological power dynamic is to really see it as a mutual learning opportunity. Dr. Martin Luther King said that a true revolution of values will see that the Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others, nothing to learn from them, is not just. So, meaning we're not just thinking about technology and improving flourishing as this thing that we're going to take and give, but that we can actually receive as well, and maintaining that, as I've said, like intellectual humility in that process. So here's my little schematic again. And now I'd like to discuss some more, please. I'm glad that you guys are talking to me. So first, if there's any of these that really jump out at you, we can go to them first, but I'll start with the first one for now. So remember, collaborative intelligence is kind of combining artificial intelligence, which to me, and you can correct me if I am misguided in that, but is like, to me, the pinnacle of like quantitative data. How can you combine that with qualitative things, with the human element? What do you think the challenges of embracing collaborative intelligence might be? Do you think it's even a good thing? And how can you balance that integration with, at the same time, decolonizing the academy and bringing in those standpoint perspectives, that lived knowledge?
Yeah, so I think there's already kind of like a sense of incorporating that qualitative element of human behavior in artificial intelligence. Like, even if we look at things like supervised learning, right? Like when you give your artificial intelligence feedback, like human feedback on it, right? It will help them train and give better results in the future, right? Mm-hmm. And I think like a kind of like a clear example of that is, like, I was on Twitter and basically like some AI, like it wouldn't recognize people of color as like a person, right? Yeah. So, but if your data is like totally skewed to where like all the people in your data like are people that that aren't ethnic, then it would obviously be skewed to make those kind of decisions. But if you supervise the learning, give it negative rewards when it makes the wrong decisions and so forth, then you better improve that the results of the artificial intelligence. So yeah, I think elements of that are already pretty prevalent in like the practice of training AI, and that's like kind of a clear example of that.
Thank you. I'm glad someone here knows about artificial intelligence more than I do. What else do you guys think? Because one challenge that I have with it is like, how do you, or can you, distill a human experience, and like, how do you even put such different things together, right? Like human experience isn't ones and zeros, right? It's so multidimensional and so complex. How do we do that? How do we balance those perspectives? And I think it doesn't need to be like 50-50 all the time, every time. It can be more situational, where certain things make sense to have more of a data-driven approach and integrating perspectives on top of that, or maybe vice versa, like slightly less. But how do you think those two perspectives can be integrated without really biasing one over the other, or is it possible?
Yeah, I think even like you said, like some like it maybe shouldn't be like a 50-50 split all the time, and in some circumstances or some issues or problems that you're trying to solve, it might be beneficial to be partial to one over the other. And yeah, and I think it's like, you kind of talk about, you touched on the idea of like, yeah, the human experience can't be compiled down to 0 and 1s. And then I think like the other side of the coin is like you said, sometimes it's better to be more, quantitatively focused. So it's like, how can humans, right, like machines having that human element, but also humans having that machine element to think algorithmically and like robotically, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't, that doesn't really, just a point of discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're not going to solve this problem today, but I appreciate hearing your perspective, and that yeah, it really is, because then we're saying, okay, it's not going to be 50-50, but then how do we decide what percentage it should be? Like, should the human make that decision? Should the machine make that decision? It's so complicated.
So,
Yeah.
the one thing I think is that we should always be expecting surprises. Like the obvious simplistic assumption, you can get just spectacular answers back that you realize things are extremely different. If you look at the AI Seinfeld story, you probably all know that Seinfeld was a very successful sitcom, and now AI Seinfeld, starting in December 2022, gave you the opportunity to relive the same experience, but it would never end. It would go on forever, right? Mm-hmm. But then it went wrong, and so they stopped it because it was becoming biased in an unacceptable way, and that occurred just a couple of days ago. So, I mean, earlier on, you had said, oh, yeah, the story is that humans become, addicted to sitcoms, and when you have something like that, it just goes on forever. But no, it didn't go on forever. And it's the AI component that led to the error that caused them to end programs. Similarly, if you think about Nepal and us, we spent quite considerable time, Taryn and I and others, planning a version of this course for Nepal. But if you think about, well, okay, so if we had done that, we would have learned stuff, they would have learned stuff. But the only time in my life where my thought patterns were sort of dissected over a 4 to 5 hour period occurred in Nepal, where a leader there that Taryn and I know quite well just sat me down and said, the reason I've asked for this private dinner is that I want to see what makes you tick. So tell me everything. Who are your major influencers? In what sequence did they influence you? Why have some parts of your life gone the way they did, and so on? Yeah. So I spilled the beans, and I've never done that with anyone else. I never encountered anybody who seemed to have that 5-hour period where they wanted to see what made me tick. But I think if you think about self-reflection, it helps to have at least one experience where there's somebody else there, where you're trying to explain who you are, but you're doing that to another person and they're really interested. If I had never been to Nepal, as far as I know, I would have never had that experience in my entire life. And isn't that surprising? Because it's not what you would think you're going there for. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you've really touched on like how complicated the human experience is, like who you are is so multifaceted. And the person you've become and the things that you do even day to day is so multifaceted, like complicated and layers. And it's really hard to distill down and explain the human experience, even just to other people, but even like working together with artificial intelligence, like it would be so complicated putting those two things together, hey? Or it could be. Like it's not just the simplistic thing.
Yeah, like I've read many versions, the Sony Aibo robotic dog going back to, I don't know, 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And if you actually look at what the verbal interaction is like, it's amazing how you never feel insulted or put down or dismissed. But that's a real science that most humans don't have. You talk long enough with somebody, you might accidentally say something offensive. The dog does not do that. Even if you haven't played with it for over a year, it just talks to you very slowly. Like it's punishing you, but it never says, "Hey, where you been?" Did you forget about me? No, it never does that. So, if you say, well, what can you learn from AI? You're really doing that every day because you're having automated interactions through your phone, and the machine on the other end wants something. And usually it's pretty easy to figure out what they want. And yet, if you were to say, well, I need to talk to a human, if you ask the human, well, what kind of answer, they might not know, whereas ultimately every day, each one of us is learning machine communication because we're doing it all the time,
Why don't I ask you guys my second question about culture in health research? What do you think of that concept, and how can we know that these changes that we are trying to implement aren't just being forced in the way that we kind of talked about earlier, either because they're perceived as this great thing, even though maybe the people receiving it don't understand it fully, or they kind of assume that the people with, like, if scientists are coming over or people with technology are coming over, they must know what they're doing, so we should trust them. How do you think we can balance those things, or what do you think of it in general?
I think change for the sake of change is something that's quite dangerous, and can actually lead to, the destruction of systems that actually work quite well. And to add to that, the fact that, we've established issues in whatever institution, whatever system. We're not going to fix them overnight. It's going to be a long, drawn out process to try and get things where they need to be. And just coming in and making changes to make it look like you're doing something is never going to be a long-term beneficial solution. And so when it comes to culture in health, I think we can agree that, especially in places across the world, culture wasn't really taken into consideration when implementing health systems. And we're starting to see the issue with that now. But forcing change is not going to make that any better. And in fact, could destroy whatever system is in place now, even if it's not a perfect one.
Yeah, thank you. That's an incredible answer. Yeah, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make here, that, it's never to say that the things, technology or medicine or science, it's never to say that those things couldn't be good or couldn't be useful, but that just doing it for the sake of doing it, or disrupting things that are stable in whatever way that things are operating, like those can come with incredible costs and can be of great harm to people when not done carefully. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, just a thought. I think whenever I think about like a prime example of how complicated the world really is, like when it comes to like people and culture, science, society, like just when you put everything into a bag, I think something like this is just so like, it just paints a picture of so well of how complicated things really are, right? It's like, because when you think of something like I was watching a video yesterday, and this person was talking about how like tuberculosis kills like more people than like war and like whatever combined, but like tuberculosis like is totally curable 99% of the time. So why is this still happening, right? So it's like when you have like a clear solution, but implementing it and getting it out there is like a whole nother story. Like it just, yeah. Whenever I think of complexities of like politics, science, and everything, I think cures in health and things like that is always like kind of the first example I always jump to.
Yeah, a very good example. It's not just like, the rational folks would say, well, just give people vaccines or get antibiotics, or I'm a microbiologist. I should know how TB is treated, but like let's just do those things. But it's really not that simple, right? It involves working with political figures, working with people and their biases, their availability. Like it's so complicated. Yeah, I'm glad that you guys share that perspective. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing I usually like to explore is how technology can improve health outcomes in like rural communities in like third world countries, for example. So I'll take my grandma for this scenario. So she lives in a very rural area in Sri Lanka, and she's never even like held an iPhone, for example. So if we were to introduce a like totally automated healthcare system there, all of a sudden, would that geriatric population in that region feel comfortable going to use it? Would they just stay at home and instead just kind of suffer instead? So I guess this was a really important thing for me to consider now. It's usually the logical answer would be, oh, it would improve healthcare outcomes, so we should implement technology like that in that community. But then you got to circle back to how do they see it? And the answer is usually probably not the way that we see it. So I think that's a really good point. So thank you for sharing that whole topic with us.
No, that's a really great example. Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at here. That, you know, wanting to improve the lives of people, and, you know, having the best intentions and coming with like these really rational answers. It all seems lovely and simple, but it's rarely that that's the case. And so understanding those nuances and understanding how, you know, maybe, I mean, I don't know your grandma, but maybe there's some folks who just, they're content. Like they don't want the iPhone. They don't want the healthcare. They just want to stay and kind of live out their days. And that's perfectly happy for them. And so like kind of complicating that and really, nuancing how we think about technology and medicine in this context. Okay, I'll stop sharing the slides because I think we're just about done. Does anyone have any last questions or comments for me?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of the Inquisition and then modern psychiatry. One very moving thing, and I'm telling you that you can all do it, but you probably won't all try to do it. You can make psychiatrists cry by telling them a story about a successful cure of psychiatric illness, because most of them see that so seldom that they just are like, it's such an emotional thing when there's an actual cure and somebody becomes completely better, you know, in a realm where the likelihood of that is relatively small. So, I mean, that's another side of it, is even psychiatrists feel some misgiving about the situation that they find themselves in. You know, they would like it to be a bit quicker to get diseases cured, you know, than it is.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not trying to pick on psychiatry. Like that was the example that he gave. But yeah, it's a difficult field for sure.
So there's one other thing I want to point out that I'm big on, but as you would say, I have a bias, and that is timeless content. And if you think about it, you've experienced timeless content sort of in two layers in this particular teaching session. First of all, 5 years later, 10 years, 15, 20, somebody coming back to this could still get something out of it. It's not like, it's all old stuff now. And similarly, Alan Watts' audio, so, you know, he has three kids, three sons, and they're all still making money on his work. One sells the audio files, another the video, another the text. And it's all a viable business. All three components. So they're making royalties from, you know, the everything video game. It is really cool that guy had ideas that are relevant now and will be relevant 10, 15, 20 years. You know, they will probably always be things that are valuable to human beings to listen to. And they don't seem dated, like you say, gee, Taryn asked me to watch this stupid video. And, you know, when that guy was alive, you know, I mean, no, it doesn't feel like that, right? Yeah. It really is timeless.
Yeah.
And a lot of your world is not predicated on timeless stuff. If you're running a startup company, you need a brand that you can sell, and you keep burnishing your brand so it remains gleaming and appealing and so on. And having timeless content just doesn't kind of fit with that. But there still needs to be some component of companies out there that are taking these ideas that smart humans came up with that are of persisting value as the decades go on. Those ideas still work, are still worth thinking about. So that's part of what you experienced today.
Yeah, I reflected on that a lot watching that video. Like, for context, he died, I think it was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And it feels like that video feels like it could have been made today. Yeah, I've definitely reflected on that too, that those ideas, but it also speaks to his point that we kind of repeat the same patterns a little bit, and that it's difficult for us to learn from our mistakes. And maybe part of the human condition is, like maybe he's touching on something deeper about the human condition there.
Right. Speaking of the human condition, I just want to change topic entirely. Now that we've had this teaching session, you may be feeling a bit warm and fuzzy and like you'd like to spend more time with the rest of your class. And of course, you can do that tomorrow night. And that's the black tie dinner. And for those of you who don't have a ticket yet, I bet there still are tickets, because I think we have the biggest table. We have a table of 10 that only has 9 people at it at the moment. So there's even an extra space at our table of 10. Yeah. So, and I'm really proud. I don't know if I'm right. Maybe there'll be lots of tables of 10, but I somehow don't think so. That celebrating female leaders should be something that everybody is into, but I'm not sure that everybody is yet, although they will be eventually. Yeah. So anyway, I look forward to that very much. And I have an antique Iron Man that says things when you push in his chest, and all he needs is a new set of batteries and he's good to go. So I'm going to get new batteries and bring him there. So he can be the 10th person at the table if no one else shows up. So anyway, that's the plan for tomorrow night at the faculty club. And I really look forward to spending some face-to-face time with you guys there. So anyway. Okay, thank you very much, Taryn, for an excellent teaching session.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank
See
you.
you.